Sure.
Don't get shy and walk away. I'll be like, bring your mic back.
You got it.
Wow. I mean, people were
They're ready.
to get
They're
out
ready
of
for
the
a
house
program.
and excited
Yeah.
about lumbering.
Well, then this morning they were actually predicting a little snow through the area, but apparently that didn't happen.
Yeah.
Something like snow between 10 and 12, but
I saw that a little bit, but then
yeah.
I figured it's like so warm. It
Oh
probably
yeah, yeah. Not to mention it was just flurries.
All right, hi. Hey, this is a great crowd. Well, Happy New Year. Welcome to the Castle Museum. I'm Jennifer Vanette, your outreach coordinator, and it's my pleasure to welcome this amazing crowd. We're really excited to have you here and to have you here to hear about lumbering from our guest speaker. Before I introduce him, I just want to do a couple housekeeping items. We are very packed in. I don't think there are any empty. Are there any empty chairs left? Okay, so we've got 1, 2, like 3 maybe if people trickle in. If you're looking for a chair right now, there's 1, 2, 3. No, 3. And if we have to, we'll try to get people in as they need to. Thank you for your patience with all of this. Again, we're really excited about the crowd, and you kind of caught us off guard a little. We had to run and get more chairs, so that's a great problem. Restrooms, if you don't know, there is a single restroom towards that back door. We ask that you use the back door during the presentation time, but if that one is occupied and you want other restrooms, they are down. If you go make your way down the hall towards the front desk, they can guide you to restrooms on the lower level. And there is an elevator if you need that elevator. There are little bits of bites of treats in the back at this point. I don't know. We might have packed so many people around them that they get all the treats. I don't know. But if you're looking for something. And then just to let you know, since this is popular today, our next Lunch and Learns are second and fourth Tuesdays at noon. And so our next one would be January 24th. And we will have our own Dr. Catherine Ellison, our new marketing assistant, who is also a historian. And she's going to talk about manufacturing a victory, Saginaw in World War II. So hopefully you're interested in that. If you like to do evening programs, we do an evening program every third Thursday at 5:30. And this month, that would be January 19th. And we will have Dr. John Basler from SVSU talking about Clearer Than the Truth, the Polygraph, and the Cold War. So those talks should be interesting as well, but I know today's will be very exciting because we love our lumber history in Saginaw. It kind of put us on the map, which our speaker, Rich DePlonty, is going to tell you all about. Rich is retired electrician from next year, but he's also an amateur historian and a wonderful volunteer for us here at the Castle Museum, immensely knowledgeable. So we're really excited to have Rich with us to talk today. So I'm going to shut up and let him start talking. So thank you, everybody. Thank you, Rich.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. Boy, it's so good to see all you here today. Such a great crowd. I'm really happy to see that. So before I get started here, I just want to kind of explain a little bit about why I have kind of an interest in Saginaw history. And if you're like me, if you live in Saginaw or you're from Saginaw, or even if you grew up here, I'm assuming that you have a curiosity about how the city grew. So just kind of like a show of hands, how many people currently live in Saginaw? Holy cow, just about a good number. And how many grew up in Saginaw? Oh yeah, quite a few, sure. So let me ask you this. Did you grow up on the west side or on the east side of Saginaw? How many on the east side? Yeah, wow, quite a few, yeah. So you have some fond memories of that you grew up in? Absolutely. Yeah, I know I did. It's kind of a shame to see what's happened to some of those neighborhoods and so many homes have deteriorated and so forth. And just to kind of give you an idea about the neighborhood that I grew up in and why I was fond of it and that type of thing, just kind of get a little reference for some of you that may not be familiar with Saginaw. This is actually the West Side Saginaw, West Side Business District. Here's Ojibwe Island. the Grove District, Hoyt Park. And over here, this is pretty much east side. We're up in here somewhere right now at the Castle Museum. But that's where I grew up, over in the east side. And get a little closer into that area, I grew up in what they call the Cathedral District. The Cathedral District, I believe, was named after St. Mary's Cathedral. And it's just a very historic district as far as a lot of the homes that are situated there. A lot of lumber baron homes. Beautiful neighborhood, really. I mean, I could just only imagine what it was like, say, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. I know even when I grew up in the 60s, it was a very nice neighborhood. This is actually this little triangle right about in here, and I can make that a little bit bigger. This is where I grew up. And just kind of give you an idea about why I like that neighborhood. You can see this is actually where I was, where my house was, 1222 Sheridan. You notice that it's not there anymore, it's just green. And it's kind of common with so many of the homes around here. They've all been, most of them been torn down. I went through recently, and it's just amazing. So many neighbors that used to live in that area are all gone. But one of the things I liked about the neighborhood was the sidewalks. You ever notice that Saginaw was laid out for the most part in a grid pattern, and they had these manageable blocks, right? We always call it, what block did you live on? And there was sidewalks. Later on, my dad moved us out into the township, Saginaw Township, and are there any sidewalks out there? No. You got to walk on the road or ride your bike on the road or whatever. It wasn't practical, but mostly every neighborhood in Saginaw had sidewalks and had all these beautiful trees. And one of the things I liked about our old house, and though I can't show you, unfortunately I don't have a picture of it, here's a picture of an old home that was similar. Obviously I didn't grow up in a lumber baron home, but one of the things I loved about our home, though, and it didn't look quite like this as far as the porch is concerned, but I loved the porch. Big porch, and everybody seemed to sit on their porch and sit on their swing and swing on it and watch the world go by. I just have fond memories of that, of sitting on the porch and seeing our neighbors on their porch. And the other thing was the trees. I believe there was basically a project back in around the early 1900s, an Arbor Day program to plant trees. And I'll tell you, there's some of the nicest hardwood trees in the neighborhood. I especially remember this big maple next to us, and in the fall it turned yellow and the sun would shine through it, and it was just this beautiful glow of yellow on the ground. And it just, other things that were in the neighborhood, the massive elms and the majestic oaks. It was just a beautiful neighborhood. And I remember riding around my bike, and like I said, obviously I didn't live in a lumber baron home, but I did see many of the homes that were in the Cathedral District as I rode my bike, and I used to marvel at the size of them. This is the Hill House, and it's currently being renovated just down the road on Jefferson here. Another home that just recently went up for sale on Warren, another lumber baron mansion. And here's one, they call it the Caskey lumber baron home. That's the original owner. He was a lumber baron. And this, again, is just right down here in the road. Rick Rios has been reconditioning or rehabbing that home for the past 20 years. It's just beautiful what he's done with it. That's kind of nice to know. There's some people coming back into the area and rehabbing these homes and bringing it back. You can see how beautiful that home looks. Here's a home on Millard from 1884 to give you an idea of how old some of these homes are. Here's another one from 1878 on Owen, and then one that I remember many times driving by this one. It was built in 1857. Isn't that amazing when you think about it? That was before the Civil War. And this home is currently for sale as well, and it's really well maintained. It's just looks like a very nice home, but again, some people may or may not want to live in these neighborhoods just because perception of crime. And whether that's real or not, that's not really my point here. My point is that really, if you're like me, you tend to wonder what happened to this great city. So in other words, I assume it was a great city. I mean, I think we would assume that with these lumber baron homes and these nice neighborhoods. And yeah, so many things have happened. The Potter Street Station. I grew up in the 60s. Some of you probably remember when this was in operation. I don't. But that must have been quite the heyday when even people that worked in the forests, you know, with the white pine, and coming back on the train from the lumber camps. Must have been quite a time back then. But again, that's well deteriorated. We'll be lucky if that comes back. The Saginaw Fair. They say that the Saginaw Fair was the largest county fair east of the Rockies. Can you imagine that? Here in little old Saginaw, we had the largest fair on this whole side of the eastern seaboard. The abandoned homes, you've seen my old neighborhood, how there's just a lot of green spots. It's basically returning back to nature. I guess that's a good thing if they get rid of those old homes that have been burned down or abandoned, but still it's a shame to see so many things go to waste. I remember going to the old Western Auto in downtown Saginaw, and I don't know what condition this is in now, but there's so many bricks crumbling, they're falling on the sidewalk, and they had to, close the sidewalk off. And of course, so many abandoned buildings down in the downtown area in Genesee, and of course, the landmarks that we've lost, like the Michigan Bean Bunny. So yeah, you see where I'm kind of going with this, and hopefully it kind of brought back some memories for some of you that did grow up here, and you're thinking the same thing I'm thinking. Was Saginaw a great city? Like I said, we kind of got that idea that it was, and obviously that is kind of the subject of what I'm talking about here. But we were the lumber capital of the world. Now, that's not an exaggeration. When we think about that for a minute, to say that we were the lumber capital of the world, they're talking about, when you say that, we're not just talking about Michigan. We're not just talking about the United States. We're talking about the world. So literally, there was more lumber milled here in Saginaw and on the Saginaw River than anywhere else in the world. And lumber is pretty important. So between 1860 and 1890, we held that title, literally the lumber capital of the world. That's just amazing. A small city like Saginaw, how did that happen? And we can, honestly ask ourselves, why Saginaw? Why has Saginaw become this place in Michigan, of all places, right? So let's kind of start to kind of understand this. As far as this whole idea about lumber, most of us know what lumber is, right? It's the stuff that we build homes and businesses with, right? We frame out the house with the lumber, typically 2x4. So we're all really familiar with that. And you have to have lumber to build things, not just then, but now, right? So it's obviously a commodity that's definitely needed. But one thing to keep in mind when it comes to lumber is that the preferential building material comes from white pine trees. So that's kind of the key here, is where these white pines are located in the United States. And white pine is basically the country's basic building material. So why white pine? Well, the reason is it's ideal. And there's a number of reasons why white pine is ideal. It has few knots. Now, most of us know what knots are. They're essentially little round things in the wood. And some of us probably have a cabin or something up north that's got knotty pine on the wall. That looks kind of nice, right? But for the most part, you don't want lumber with knots in it. The problem with knots is that they're hard and dense like hardwood, and you try to cut into it, and it chips your blade or it falls out and so forth. So the thing about white pine is very few knots. It's soft. It's easy to work. That's kind of important. You're cutting a lot of lumber in a lumber mill. You don't want hardwoods. Hardwoods are great for furniture and for floors, like an oak flooring or something. But when it comes to cutting so much lumber that's needed for homes and businesses, you want it to be able to easily work it, right? You want to be able to saw it quickly and easily. And it's light. Hardwoods are heavy. Pine is very light. But the great part about it, even though you have all of these characteristics about pine, that it has few knots, it's soft, easy to work, and light, it's durable. You could go and look inside of a wall from a house that was built 150 years ago, and that white pine board, that true 2-inch by 4-inch board, is still intact inside that wall. Nothing's happened to it. They virtually last forever as long as it's not outside in the weather. So white pine is a very good material to build homes. So where do we find this white pine? Well, you can see in this depiction here where it's kind of shaded in the United States. Here's Michigan, of course, and over here on the East Coast. That's showing you the forestry concentration in the United States. So when I say forestry, I'm not just referring to white pine. I'm also talking about hardwoods. So there's a good amount of hardwoods that's through the Smokies and Appalachians that extends down to the south. But you can see that most of the concentration of forestry in the United States tends to be, especially white pine, in a cooler northern climate of the country. So where it's cool and humid, that's where you're going to find the most white pine. So depleted elsewhere, what happened is these timber investors that look for that white pine, because that's what they do, that's their business, is to locate the white pine, of course, cut it down, send it to a mill, and then send it out to the market. But what happened is that as they worked their way across the United States over here on the East Coast and worked in through New York, they basically depleted it. So in other words, they had to move across the country in that region of the United States to continue to get white pine to feed the needs of the nation, of a growing nation. Now you can see in this depiction here that there was a very heavy concentration with this kind of aqua color here on the United States. This is showing the greatest concentration of where forests were in the United States at that time. Obviously that was some time ago, so these were basically barely taken. This was considered wilderness out here. I mean, just in the original 13 colonies is where you had most of what was going on as far as civilization, but that was never touched, right? But look what happened just 200 years later. Once this westward motion or a movement across the country, you can see how they're starting to deplete, and especially look in New York. Now, New York was a state that had a high concentration of white pine. But by 1850, you can see that it clearly was mostly depleted. So the timber investors from the east that were investing into lumber production, they basically would just use up the resources, and then move across the country. Just so you can see what happened ultimately, by 1920, what happened? All gone. And that's what they did. There was no forestry conservation back in those days. By 1920, they just cut it all down. All there was stumps, right? And of course, then the good thing is farmers would come in, and then agriculture became a big part of the country's, economic output. But where did all the wood go? Yeah, it's all gone. Fortunately, obviously nowadays, big companies like Weyerhaeuser, they obviously they're in forestry management and so forth. But I just wanted to show you that literally by 1920 it was all gone. So by 1850, with the depletion of the forests, the white pine forests in New York and all those areas on the East Coast, timber investors set their eyes on Michigan. So what else could they do? They went to the next place where there was a market for it. This kind of shows you, again, the concentration in Michigan. And when it comes to pine trees, you can see they tended to be more to the north than they were to the south. That's not to say that there wasn't any down here, but this is mostly hardwoods. So those hardwoods being oak and elm and maple and those types of things, which are, again, great for furniture, great for flooring and that type of thing, but not good for building. So really the most of the concentration were to the north. And again, it's that cool and humid and wet environment, especially along rivers. Wherever there's rivers, the river systems, you tend to get it. Now, obviously, there were some pines down here. I'm just saying that most of them were more to the north. They say that a squirrel can travel the forest canopy from one side to the other. Obviously, that was a little bit of an exaggeration. But if you're wondering what they mean by the canopy, here is a good example of one of those white pine trees. This is actually what they call the monarch. It's in Hartwick Pines, or was, I should say, north of Grayling's. Anybody been to Hartwick Pines? Yeah, oh yeah, most of you have been there. Beautiful place. If you haven't been to Hartwick Pines, it's a good place to see some current white pine trees. And one of the things you'll notice, look at the trunk of that tree. Now that is very typical. A lot of the pictures that I'm going to show you are going to show the trunk of trees that look just like that, straight up. In fact, one of the wonderful things about these pine trees that they found in Michigan is that you could get a 40-foot long board, 2 feet wide, with almost no knots in it. It's just amazing to think that the lumber that they were taking out of these trees. Now, the canopy at the top, you notice that there's no branches along the trunk. It's straight and no branches. That is a good indication of why there was no knots, because the knots come when the branches come out along the trunk. With no branches, you're not going to get any knots. Well, why was there no branches at the lower end? Because the canopy up at the top was so big it would blot out the sun. The sun couldn't come down and feed the branches below, and they died off, which actually made for the best trees. So that's why they say the squirrel could actually, the trees are so close together, literally it was dark at the forest floor, because it was just like a roof above you with this canopy very dense up there. So when these timber investors set their eyes on Michigan, the next source of white pine timber, it made their eyes pop. They just could not believe what they had seen. What they discovered is that in this area lied 3 million acres of the finest timber ever found. Now again, that's no exaggeration. It literally was worldwide the finest timber in this area that they had ever seen. They could just not believe what they were looking at. This point right here, now you notice that there's this thing, there's an imaginary, if you could place an imaginary line from Bay City across to Muskegon, they call that the frost-free line. Now, the significance of that is that everything above that tends to be a cooler climate. In fact, what that really just means is that on the southern side of that line, 150 days a year is free of frost. Now that's good for farming. So that's why most of the agriculture in Michigan is in the southern part of the state, because you got a longer season for growing and less frost days. But above that line, while you don't have as many farms up north of this area, is because it's cooler on an average basis. So, but though it's better for farming down here, it's better for growing trees up there. Again, a wet environment and very cool. Yes, sure.
May I interject?
Yes.
Also, that line that you talk about, the dirt, the soil is all black.
Oh yeah.
The greatest advantage, all sand.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Thank you, sir. And matter of fact, and thank you for pointing that out. Something I meant to say earlier. Rather than waiting towards the end, if you have any questions, please stop me. I don't want to, I want to keep this going, but at the same time, if you yell and say, hey, Rich, what about this? Feel free to do that. Anytime you can raise your hand and ask a question. I found it's better that way. I'll do my best to try to answer any questions you have. It's not going to bother me if you stop me in the midstream or something, so feel free to do that. Okay, and thank you again for your comment. So one of the things I wanted to point out is, along this point here from Midland up the Tittabawassee River, they say that there was a solid belt of pine that ran 80 miles. It was considered the best in the whole United States, and probably the best in the world. Can you imagine that? 80 miles of pine. It must have just been magnificent to see these pines. I try to imagine what that must have looked like. These massive pines, and literally, the best pine trees in the whole United States, and they were massive. I'll talk about those in just a minute. But, one of the things I would love to do, if I could go back in time, this is one of the places I'd want to see. I'd want to go back and see those virgin pines. When they say virgin, it means the forest was never cut. It had been untouched for hundreds and hundreds of years. So that's when you want to see it, right? Has anybody been to the redwoods in California? Yeah, there's some. Yep, my wife back there, she said she's been there. I personally have not been there. I'd love to see it someday. I did go up to, my daughter lived out in Seattle for a while, and we went up Mount Rainier and saw the cedars. Those are massive trees as well, if anybody's seen the cedars on Mount Rainier in Washington State. But again, these trees must have been magnificent. They say that they were over 200 feet high. Now, if that's hard to kind of reference in your mind, well, what does that mean, 200 feet? Well, here's kind of a reference for you. I think a lot of us are familiar with the Huntington Bank, used to be Second National Bank in downtown Saginaw. If you ever look up and see how tall that thing is, pretty tall. It's about 187 feet high. So essentially, these trees were taller than that bank on average, just to give you an idea how big they were. They live up to 500 years. Can you imagine letting a tree grow for 500 years and not touching it? Well, there's nobody here to touch it. Do you think they'd let a tree grow 200 to 500 years now? Yeah, something would happen to it. Somebody cut that baby down or do something to it, or clear the land and put a building up, right? But because it was pristine, it was virgin, it was never touched, they were allowed to grow that big. And can you imagine a tree 7 feet in diameter, right? Massive tree. How many people would it take to wrap your hands around to actually encircle that tree? Here's a picture of what one of them looked like, just to give you an idea. Not as big as redwoods or the cedars in Washington State, but yeah, they were big. It was from massive trees. Now, if you're curious if you've ever seen one, every now and then I'll be around Saginaw, maybe walking or riding my bike, and I see some trees and I know that they're white pines. If you're curious to identify what a white pine looks like, it's different than a lot of other pine trees. It tends to have these needles They're soft and flexible. Unlike a lot of other pines, they're real kind of prickly and they kind of poke you, and they're hard. No, these are actually kind of soft. And if you separate one of the bundles apart, you'll notice they grow in groups of 5. So I'm just saying, if you ever see a tree and you think to yourself, wow, I wonder if that's a white pine. And yeah, I got one right here. So what I'll do is, and it'll probably take a while to make its way around, but if you'd like to see one, and this is kind of dried out. It's not, I picked it a while back, but in any event, if you know, we'll pass it around. Might take the end of the lecture to get to the back, but in any event, you can see that they do grow in groups of 5. So if you'd like to pass that around. So again, you know, it's just kind of interesting to basically know, you know, when you're seeing a white pine tree. So we're kind of at that point now. We know what white pine is. We know that there's a big stand of it through Michigan, especially 80 miles, some of the best of it going up the Tittabawassee River, which is still a little ways from Saginaw. Why Saginaw? Why did Saginaw become the center of lumber production? Well, it lies in this basic fact. Saginaw is unique because of the Saginaw Bay watershed, which encompasses almost 9,000 square miles, all in this blue right here, has over 7,000 miles of rivers. Can you imagine all the streams and all the tributaries that all feed this? So this is basically this concentration of water that flows into the Saginaw River and then out to Saginaw Bay, right? So all the rivers flow to Saginaw. I think you're kind of getting the idea now, you know, what's the significance here? They all flow to Saginaw. And just get an idea about the elevation. So why do they do that? Well, because they're higher than we are. You know, I remember hearing virtually my whole life that one of the reasons why we don't see a tornado in the city of Saginaw is because we're in a valley. I don't know if that's a myth or not. The tornado goes above our heads and it never comes down. And then God forbid if it ever comes down into the valley, because we're going to get wiped out, right? Because it can't get out, you know. But when you start to hear these elevation changes, I think you're going to kind of an appreciation how deep our valley actually is. One of the first points that I want to make is about Saginaw itself. Where does it lie in regards to sea level? Well, we're about 584 feet above sea level. Well, that sounds pretty significant. In other words, you can see it all flows down to the sea from Saginaw at some point, flows out to the bay and into the lakes and so forth. And then notice that Saginaw Bay is at 581 feet. So there's only a 3-foot difference between the city of Saginaw and all the way out through Bay City to the bay. 3 feet. That's what causes the Saginaw River to flow. Well, it flows, we know it does, so that 3 feet must make a big difference, right? But look at some of these other numbers, these other outlying areas of the Saginaw Bay watershed and the height that they lie at. As an example, Gladwin up here in the north and Owasso down here in the south, they're both at 728 feet. They're 144 feet higher than Saginaw. That's pretty significant. In fact, when I looked it up, I thought, wow, that really kind of gives you an idea of when they say we're in a valley, we truly are in a valley. And it's true in every direction that you go. Over here at Cass City, 745 feet or 161 feet higher than Saginaw. Down at Flint, a lot of times, you know, we compare ourselves to Flint, you know, both auto production cities. You think we have a lot of similarity with Flint, except Flint's 167 feet higher than us. All their water flows to us, right? And then here, Mount Pleasant, the highest at 187 feet. But maybe that's where the mountain came from. I don't know. It's not kind of a short mountain, right? But still, it's 187 feet higher than Saginaw, though. So it might give a new meaning to you when you hear somebody talk about Mount Pleasant. They're quite a bit higher to us. So you kind of get this idea that all that water flows to Saginaw. So what is the significance of that? Well, how do you move 3 million acres of timber to where it is needed? So in other words, where it could be milled. That's kind of the concentration here. Now, trying to move it through the forests are extremely dense. You know, you'd have to cut a road or something, and then it's going to be very bumpy. So travel by land, and I think most of you know, if you're not originally from Saginaw, most of the cities and towns in the United States have been founded on rivers. In other words, or near lakes. And the reason, because that's how commerce and people were moved. Here's a steamer, they call it the Wellington R. Burt. He was one of the lumber barons, and you can see all the people back at this time, back in 1887, taking a trip to Bay City from Saginaw. So we moved people on the water, but we also moved the cut logs on the water, right? And that's the significance, is that you can cut them in all those distant locations, 80 miles up the Tittabawassee, and then float it down to Saginaw. One common destination being Saginaw, the Saginaw River. And that's why they concentrated the lumber mills on the Saginaw River. And then once it was milled, it was cheap to move the lumber along the Great Lakes. So in other words, once it was milled at the lumber mills on the Saginaw River, they loaded on these ferries and then transport it where it was needed around the country. Now some of that lumber might have made its way up going west and through the Chicago market, but most of the lumber milled in the Saginaw area actually went into Lake Huron, up through Saginaw Bay, down through Lake St. Clair, up to Lake Erie, then ultimately through the Erie Channel, and then through lumber markets in that area. And then, of course, you get into the Hudson River, and you get all the way to New York. So our lumber, for the most part, fed the East Coast. And you got to remember, too, that a lot of this happened after the Civil War. So point being is there's a lot of homes that were destroyed, a lot of businesses destroyed during the Civil War. I'll bet you there's some old southern mansions that were rebuilt down in the south that still have Saginaw lumber in them to this day, because so much of that lumber made its way into that market. So now let's kind of talk about how this kind of got started. In other words, what brought this boom on that made Saginaw that lumber capital of the world? Well, in the mid-1800s, around 1850, that time frame, Saginaw was just a quiet river settlement. In other words, there's really not much going on here. People that were looking for another way of life, they found their way to Saginaw. You know, there was definitely the wilderness. I mean, there's just a place, you know, people always seeking a place to go to be free, you know, that type of thing where they can have their own plot of land. Now, this drawing right here is really accurate. It was prepared by a historian here, considered one of the best historians in Saginaw's history, Fred Dustin from 1930s. And he drew this drawing of the west side of Saginaw. So if we're on the east side looking across the river, that's what you would see. And just kind of get this idea here, what would be on the east side? Nothing. Why? Because it was flooded. It was all swamp. And on the west side, and it's true to this day, of course, from the river edge up, it precipitously rose 10 to 12 feet. So in other words, it was dry ground. So initially back in this period of time, Saginaw just consisted of Saginaw City, and it was on the high ground of the west side of the river. So that's why that was the first part that was settled in Saginaw. And just kind of get a little bit of a reference here, this was Mackinac Street. Over here was Court Street. So that was the concentration at that period of time. And that's all Saginaw was. But keep in mind that these timber investors had exhausted that lumber out on the East Coast and through New York, and now they're setting their eyes on this area. And they saw that 3 million acres, and then they started to come in. One prominent timber investor came with his father, Norman Little, back in the 1820s. And he come back over a period of 25 years, and he kind of brought it on, so to speak. He started that boom. And what he did is he bought 2,400 acres on the east bank. Wow. Can you imagine what they were thinking about him? They buy 2,400 acres of swampland? I mean, literally, that's what he did. But he had a vision, and actually he made it come to fruition. He wanted to build his own city. So after he became an adult and the principal in his timber investing firm, he thought he's going to make Saginaw the next big lumber capital. So he was it was very much a big part of causing the boom. Now I'm showing you this picture. It's actually from 1867. You can see it was a little while. It was some years after he had made his purchase. There is some development on the east side. Here's some lumber mill interest, a few homes kind of sprinkled around. But even that much time, 19 years after he purchased it, look at this is like the middle part. So really from the north end, which some people call the first ward of Saginaw, where the downtown area is, into the middle section where you'd have Ojibwe Island and Hoyt Park and so forth, and down into South Saginaw, that was all just foul and swampy at that time when he purchased it. But even 19 years later, it still was. This is kind of, in this drawing, they're still showing so much of the land not used because you either fill it in or you drain it somehow, but it just wasn't usable. But that's what they did, of course. They filled it in, and they did manage to drain it. Now, one of the things that Norman Little did was he built a plank road 32-mile plank road from Flint all the way to Saginaw. Now, if you're wondering what we mean by plank, we're talking about wood. Have you ever heard of a wood road? Is that the craziest idea? But it was common. Pardon me?
Corduroy road.
Oh yeah, corduroy road. Yeah, yeah. In fact, I heard that term also when it came to like log roads, because it was like boom, 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 boom. Yeah, yeah, exactly. But this was genius because basically he needed to. Now try to imagine what this path is. It's, basically Genesee going into the Dixie Highway and then down to Flint. That same path that we travel today when we go down Genesee and down the Dixie Highway. That's the same path that he followed. And why this is significant and why he did it, even though it seems kind of crazy, 32 miles of wooden road, was because he needed to be able to get people and commerce to come to his new city, which is East Saginaw. Saginaw City was on the west side, on the high ground. His was all wet and watery on the east side, and he needed a way to get people up here. And that was his plan. To get people, and Flint was a little more well established in the sense that there was paths already established to that. And Norman Little was kind of fortunate as well because he was able to follow a same path that the military had cut through the forest in 1922. That saved him a little bit, but it still did not provide a smooth path for people to follow with their wagons and so forth to bring all their supplies and start their businesses and so forth. And this is a later picture here just showing how East Saginaw had grown. So again, there's our path, our plank road coming up. Now look at this development, and I know this picture is not real clear because I had to make it bigger, but it is showing kind of this grid pattern of how East Saginaw grew here, and yet here Saginaw City just did not kind of, didn't grow nearly as much, and then you can see the concentration up there in the northern part of which is East Saginaw. So again, that plank road made all the difference, and that's one of the reasons why he was able to actually grow faster than Saginaw City, because there was no, at that time, when that plank road was created, there was no bridges across the river. There was no reason for it. Why would you cross from west side to east side to a swamp? Yep, so they didn't build no bridges. But he did have a way to get people up, and once they were here, they couldn't get across to the west side, right? So naturally, they had to start building up the east side. Yeah, exactly. And just as an aside, I think it's kind of interesting. Here's a picture of what that road looked like. And they charged tolls too. So it was 1 cent a mile if you had one horse, or if you had two, they had to pay 2 cents. Well, I don't know, I make enough money now, but I don't know, maybe 32 cents was a lot to ride the 32 miles from Flint, And if you had a team, you'd have to pay 64 cents, right? So at any rate, and as that gentleman had pointed out, yeah, within a few years, yep, it started to rot. I mean, you can't have this wood, road for too long before it starts to warp and rot. So I guess after a few years, it did create kind of a bone jolting ride. But they did have, it was still better than these log roads, like you call it a corduroy road. You can imagine logs, but that was still better than going over stumps and roots and potholes created from the rain and so forth, of a dirt road. So it was much better. And by the way, this is also a curious note. During a reconstruction project of Genesee Avenue, just outside here of downtown Saginaw, wood planks were discovered. They were the wood planks from that road. Here's a picture of a workman down there digging into it. They were 5 feet below the surface. That's weird. How did the wood planks get 5 feet down? Wouldn't they be up here? What do you think? Why were they down there? Yeah, exactly. That was the actual elevation at that time on the east side of Saginaw. And then over time, they just kept building it up. Because what else are they going to do? They got to get the water to, when it rains, to drain out to the river. And if they're as low as the river, it's never going to happen. So over the course of that century, they just kept building it up. And essentially, they got up 5 feet high. So that's where they found it. And you can see that these are actually several blocks, several planks thick. So even though this doesn't look like it's very thick, these are very staunch boards, but they were actually kind of put on top of each other. And then they identified some kind of weird substance, like a tar-like substance, and they're not really sure what it was, but they theorized that the purpose of it was to allow water, once it rained, to drain through the board, so at least it would hopefully drain off eventually. So it kind of gives you kind of an idea about how they constructed that. But just kind of neat to know that we actually